Hello everyone, Ashik this side. Welcome to my channel Kickstart Privacy. In this video, I'm going to talk about mapping GDPR principles to the vendor practices and its compliance. All right. So, mapping GDPR principles to third-party vendor compliance means aligning the foundational data protection principles outlined by the GDPR with the compliance and operational standards of a third-party vendor. All right. So these are the topics I'm going to cover today. As a privacy professional, in an organization, we should know when should we do it, why should we do it, how should we do it, and at the end we see how we can map these principles to the vendor compliance practices with some examples. All right, let's move on to the topics. So when should we do it? Mapping GDPR principles to third-party vendor compliance should be done at multiple stages in the life cycle of your relationship with vendors. Right? Let's see the stages. So these are the stages I'm going to explain. There are 7 stages. The number 1 is the vendor selection stage. So before even you start a formal relationship with the vendor, you should map the GDPR principle to their services to evaluate whether they can meet your data protection standards. Okay, this preliminary mapping can inform your decision-making process when selecting vendors. Okay, next one is the contract negotiations. During the contract negotiation, now when you are finalizing the terms of your relationship, it is crucial to have a clear understanding of the vendor's data handling responsibilities. So mapping these principles to their obligations in the contract ensures that you are both on the same page about data protection expectations. Okay. And the third point is vendor onboarding. As part of the onboarding process, go through the mapping with the vendor to ensure they understand their responsibilities. This can be part of a formal training or initial discussion with the vendors. And the next point is regular audits and or assessments. So the GDPR requires regular assessment of data handling practices, right? So when you audit or assess your own practices, it's also an appropriate time to review the vendor practices. This way, by mapping the GDPR principle to their compliance metrics, gives you a structured framework for these assessments. All right. The next point is after significant regulatory changes. If there are any significant changes or updates to GDPR or related regulations, it is wise to revisit the mapping to ensure continued compliance. Similarly, if your business has changed or expanded in a way that impacts data handling, you might need to revisit the mapping. All right. And the sixth point, the next point is after a data incident. If there has been any data breach or another incident, right, it's a critical to review all related practices. Re-examining the mapping in light of the incident can shed light on any vulnerabilities or areas for improvement. And the last one is contract renewal or vendor transition stage. Before renewing a contract with a vendor or transitioning to a new vendor, review the mapping to assess the current vendor's performance and determine any new requirements or changes for the future. All right, let's move on to the next topic. When should we do it? The reasons. So there might be a reasons to map this principle to the third party vendors. There are many reasons. I have come up with these many reasons. Let's look at it. So the reasons are liability and accountability, financial consequences, reputational risk, regulatory mandate, operational disruption, data consistent security, due diligence, contractual obligations, continued business relationship, stakeholder resistance. Let's see one by one. Liability and accountability. Even if data processing it is outsourced to a third party vendor, the primary organization, that is the data controller, remains accountable for any breaches or non-compliance, right? So the GDPR emphasizes joint responsibility, meaning both parties can be held liable. Okay. The second point is about financial consequences. So it's all about the fines. So non-compliance with the GDPR can result in significant fines. The fines up to 4% of the company's global turnover, annual turnover, or 20 million euros, whichever is higher, right? So if a third party vendor is non-compliant, the organization contracting them can face these steep penalties, right? So third point is reputational risk. There are data breaches or non-compliance events, can severely harm the reputation of an organization. A vendor's mistake can lead to loss of customer trust, which might take years to rebuild. Yes. Next one is regulatory mandate. GDPR explicitly states that organizations, the data controllers, should only work with processors, that is the vendor, that can ensure compliance with the GDPR requirements. It's not a best practice, just a best practice. It's a legal obligations, right? So next one is operational disruption. If a vendor is discovered to be non-compliant or causes a data breach, it can lead to operational disruptions, right? Organizations might need to halt the use of vendor services. Maybe they can switch to a different vendor or manage, they have to manage the aftermath of a breach. Next point is data consistency and security. So ensuring third-party vendors adhere to the GDPR principles guarantees that the personal data is handled with the same level of care and security, whether processed in-house or by the vendor. So next point is due diligence. Demonstrating due diligence is a vital aspect of GDPR. By mapping GDPR principle to vendor compliance, the organization show proactive steps in ensuring data protection across all facets of operations, right? Next point is contractual obligations. When entering contract with the third-party vendors, having a clear mapping of GDPR principles can ensure that all compliance expectations are explicitly laid out, providing a foundation for legal recourse if the vendor fails to meet their obligations. Right. Next point is continued business relationships. Ensuring GDPR compliance in vendor operations can foster long-term and trusting business relationships. It ensures both parties are aligned in their data protection practices leading to smoother the collaborations, right? The last point is the stakeholders assurance. There are investors, partners, customers, and other stakeholders demand assurance that an organization's entire operational ecosystems, including the vendors, its vendors, is compliant with the data protection laws. So, in summary, ensuring that third-party vendors are compliant with the GDPR principles is critical because of the multifaceted risk and obligations associated with the data protection in today's interconnected business world. All right, let's move on to the next topic. Yeah, how should we do it? There are steps to do it, right? So mapping GDPR principles to vendor compliance practices involves a systematic approach to ensure that the third-party vendors adhere to the data protection standards set by the GDPR. There are steps to undertake this process. Let's see the steps in the next slides, okay? So these are the 10 steps, yeah, I guess 11 steps actually. Understanding the GDPR principles. So before you start doing this as a privacy professional, we need to be more familiar with the GDPR principles. Such as lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, and confidentiality, and finally the accountability. So we need to be more familiar with these principles, what it says, and how it works, etc. So we need to clarify what each principle implies in terms of data protection and privacy obligations. Okay. In the second step, identify and list vendor activities involving personal data. So we need to document all activities where the vendor interacts with or the processes or stores personal data on behalf of your organization. Okay. Third step is to determine compliance requirements for each activity. So we have understood the GDPR principle in the first step. We have identified all the activities of the vendors processing our personal data, and we need to determine the compliance requirements for each activity. So based on the GDPR principle, we need to define specific compliance requirements that the vendor must satisfy for each activity. I give you one example. For a data storage, it is relating to storage limitation principle. So we need to define how long the data can be stored, in what format, and the conditions for data deletion. Right. So this is how we need to map the principle to each activities. I will give you a complete guideline on how to map each principles to their practices one by one in the upcoming slide. Okay. The next one is to conduct the gap analysis. So we need to conduct or compare vendors' current practices with the GDPR driven requirements you have identified. Okay, and we need to note the areas where the vendor practices align with the GDPR and the areas where they fall short. Okay, and next point is to engage. Step is to engage with the vendor. So discuss your findings from the gap analysis, understand their perspective, and any challenges they face in achieving compliance. You can also request the action plans or the timeline for any remediation needed, etc. Okay. And the next point is to document everything. Maintain detailed records of your assessments, your findings, the communications, and agreements with the vendors. This documentation, will be crucial for demonstrating your due diligence in ensuring GDPR compliance, especially in the case of audits or data breaches, etc. Okay, next point is to establish regular review cycles. So GDPR it's not a one-time task, everyone aware, because the regulations evolve as we do business and tech environments, right? So set periodic reviews of vendor compliance practices to ensure ongoing alignment with the GDPR principles. Next point is to define escalation and breach notification procedures. So we need to clearly outline the steps to be taken in case of any discrepancies, violations, or data breaches. The vendor should be clear about their timeline and protocols for notifying you, the data controller, in the event of a data breach, right? The next one is to educate and train. So make sure that both your team and the vendor teams are trained on GDPR requirements. This will foster a culture of compliance and reduce the risk of inadvertent breaches. All right. Finally, review the contracts and agreements. So ensure that all contracts with the vendors explicitly mention GDPR requirements, responsibilities, and penalties for compliance. So by following these steps, you can systematically map GDPR principles to vendor compliance practices, ensuring that the third-party vendors respect and uphold the data protection standards expected under GDPR. All right. Now let's move on to the mapping part, the actual mapping, how we can map the principles to the vendors' practices. So mapping GDPR principles to third-party vendor compliance is a proactive strategy to ensure data protection throughout the supply chain and avoid potential legal and reputational risks, right? It helps in bridging the gap between high-level regulatory principles and practical, actionable steps that vendor can and should take. Okay, let's move on to the next topic of the principles one by one and see how we can map those to the vendor practices. So the principle number 1, lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So what it says, the data processing must be lawful. For any data processing you start with, there must be a legal basis for processing, right? So that is it all about, the lawful, and must be done fairly. So that is without disadvantaging the data subjects, right? And transparently, that is the data subject we should know who is processing their data and why, etc. Let's see how the mapping we can do it. Third-party vendors should provide clear information to the data controller about its data handling practices. They should also provide the documentation or evidence showing the legal basis for its data processing activities. You can also, the evidence may include the explicit consent form, the contract forms, terms, and other legal justifications, etc. Furthermore, vendors should have a clear privacy policies that are easily accessible and understandable by the data subjects. So I have given a small example here, just one example. A cloud storage vendor should provide clear terms of service that outline how they process and store user data. They should inform if they access user data and for what purposes. So it should be very clear it should be mentioned in the contract about their data processing activities. Okay. Let's move on to the next principle, number 2, purpose limitation. What it says, the personal data must be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes and not further processed in a manner incompatible with those purposes. Right. So let's see how to map these to the vendor compliance. Ensure the vendor processes personal data only for the specific purposes that a data controller has specified in their contract or agreement, data processing agreement. So as a data controller, we should mention the purpose of the data processed in the contract. Any deviation from these purposes should be flagged by the controller, and the vendor should not engage in processing that has not been explicitly agreed upon with the vendor. Okay. For example, a bank uses a third-party vendor for email marketing, right? So that vendor should only use the provided email addresses for the agreed upon marketing campaigns and not for any other promotions or purposes. All right. Let's move on to the next principle, number 3, data minimization. So what it says, only the necessary amount of data required for the specified purpose should be collected and processed. So the data minimization principle follows the purpose limitation principle. Right. So it goes hands in hand. Let's see how to map this vendor compliance to this principle. Vendors should collect and process only the data that is necessary for the specific purpose outlined in their agreement with the data controller. Right, so we should mention everything in the data processing agreement. For example, a payment processing vendor, hired by the controller, the organization, should not collect additional data about a customer's buying habits, if their sole purpose is to process only the payments, not for any further process. Let's move on to the next principle, number 4, data accuracy. So what it says, personal data must be accurate and where necessary kept up to date. How to map this? Vendors should have a processes in place to validate the personal data they collect and mechanisms to correct inaccuracies when they are identified. Right. They should also allow the data controllers easy access to review any update data as necessary. For example, a CRM tool vendor identifies outdated or inaccurate customer data. They should notify the business, the controller, and update the records accordingly. All right. Let's move on to the next principle, number 5. Storage limitation. What it says, personal data should be kept only as long as necessary for the intended purpose. Again, based on the purpose. Okay. So how to map this? Vendors should have a clear data retention policies that align with the purposes for which data is collected. They should also offer mechanisms for data deletion, not only retention, data deletion upon the end of the retention period or upon any request raised by the data controller. All right, small example here, a cloud backup vendor should automatically delete backups that are older than the retention period agreed upon with the data controller. All right, let's move on to the next principle, number 6. Integrity and confidentiality. Basically, it is a security part of it. So what it says, data should be protected against unauthorized access, loss, or destruction using appropriate security measures. The security measures may be access control, encryption, or pseudonymization techniques or anonymization techniques, etc. So how to map this? We know vendors should provide details about their security infrastructure. Maybe you can request for the ISMS audit report if they are certified in ISO 27001 process. Okay, and protocols and practices, they must ensure the security of personal data. They handle protecting it against unauthorized access, alterations, or destruction. A small example here, a third-party customer support platform should have a strong encryption and security measures in place to protect the chat logs and customer information, right? Let's move on to the next principle, number 7. This is the last principle, accountability. So what it says, the data controller is responsible for and must be able to demonstrate compliance with the other GDPR principles. It's basically when we are complying with all other rest of the 6 principles, we comply with the 7th principle. So that is what it is. So how to map this? The vendors, acting as data processors, should maintain comprehensive records of their processing activities and be ready to present these upon any request by the data controller. They should also be open to audits from the data controllers or the relevant authorities, right? A small example here, a data analytics vendor should keep detailed log of how they process and analyze user data, ensuring they remain compliant with both GDPR and their contractual obligations to the data controller. All right. Next, conclusion. A small brief about this, what we have been discussing, right? When working with third-party vendors, it's crucial for businesses to establish clear contracts or data processing agreements that specify each party's responsibilities concerning GDPR compliance. This mapping serves as a foundation to guide and ensure that both parties understand and adhere to the required standards. All right. So with this, hope you now have a fair understanding of how, as a privacy professional, can map the GDPR principle to the vendor's practices processing personal data on behalf of an organization. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and stay tuned for more relevant topics in data privacy and protection. Bye-bye.